Very much. It's nice to be back. In fact, it doesn't really feel like I left, which I don't know if that's worrying or not. But and thank you very much for the German Marshall Fund. Also, it was fun writing the report, and I think I'm happy with it anyway. So that's good. It's the first time I've seen it in print. So DFID was created by Tony Blair as a cabinet level ministry in that flush of optimism in 1997. And I still remember that sunny May morning with the election, and kind of that optimism seemed to be carried through into development too. But it's worth noting that it's not the first time we've had an independent cabinet level ministry in the UK. And in fact, there's been a bit of a political ping pong with international development since the 60s. Development came into the cabinet in 1964 for 3 years, and then it popped out again, and then it came back again for a year in 1975. So it's not new that it's been a cabinet-level position, but I think it's true to say it really has been a golden age for DFID and for international development in the UK since 1997. And partly that's because there's a striking cross-party consensus around aid in the UK in terms of aid volume. At least it's one of only two ministries to see a real increase in budget this time round. And in the medium term, at least, I think it's inconceivable, no matter what colour government we have in place in June 2010, that the budget will be reduced as a percentage of GDP. So the kind of consensus around aid volumes, even with the crisis, I think will remain in that short to medium term. And there's also, appears to me, a clear consensus about what DFID should be doing with taxpayers' money. The International Development Act, which was passed, as you know, in 2002, requires DFID to reduce poverty. British aid can be no longer used to push political, national security or commercial ends, and tied aid is effectively banned. So the political consensus about ends is also clear. And again, no matter who takes up residence in number 10 next year, the primary aim of aid won't change, I don't think. But despite this consensus, the interviews I carried out for this report suggest that support inside Parliament is broad but not deep, at least if you look at it through the lens of aid effectiveness and the Paris Declaration. And so, picking up on Jonathan's point about afforded discretion, until recently, Parliament has deliberately given DFID considerable discretion in the way it delivers aid, because it trusts that DFID is doing all it can to meet its legal obligations under the Development Act. And one indication of this is that throughout the research it was difficult to get interviewees, particularly within Parliament, to identify ways in which Parliament has directly and specifically impacted on the way DFID works. And the way most interviewees talked about it was in terms of setting the strategic framework, and to be able to identify that this programme was changed or this budget was changed and so on was actually quite difficult. There are a few examples in there, but people were scratching their heads and it was difficult to pull those examples out of them. And in part, that is because this was a pilot project and we didn't have much time to interview people in DFID. And I think that's where the examples of where Parliament impacting on DFID will be found. But actually, I think it's also because it is that Parliament has afforded DFID this considerable discretion. And in part, it's also because the government itself and DFID itself has placed the greatest emphasis on ensuring broad political support for what it's doing, more than Parliament as a whole has worried deeply about pushing scrutiny. But also the way Parliament operates means that really select committees are the only parts of Parliament that have the time and the limited additional resources to get into the detail. And in part also DFID is unlike most other government departments in that it generates very little legislation, and so there's very little time on the floor of the House for individual MPs to actually scrutinise and debate what DFID is doing and the way DFID is doing it. So there's really only been 2 bits of legislation going through Parliament in the last 10, 12 years that relate directly to DFID. And so all of this leaves parliamentarians with limited opportunities for scrutiny of specific policy. And this relates to, and all this leads to my conclusion that the conversation between DFID and Parliament has been broad but not deep. And the inability of the majority of parliamentarians to get into the detail of how DFID is delivering aid has led to them having a limited understanding of what the agency is doing. One of my interviewees said there's probably only 50 MPs who really understand aid and aid effectiveness, and the rest, the interviewee felt didn't understand it. And so very few MPs understand why DFID has gone to such great lengths to introduce aid modalities such as budget support, and why the jargon of alignment and harmonisation and so on is so important. And in the good times, the discretion, the afforded discretion that DFID has been given has allowed it to become a true innovator in the aid world. It's assessed well against the Paris Declaration, and it's generally seen as being a model donor. But our interviews within Parliament and the recent report from the IDC calling for DFID to be named something like British aid, I can't remember exactly what it was, in order to fly the flag, UK aid was it? Indeed, there we are on the white paper itself. Combined with other noises, suggests that there's growing disquiet about the extent to which DFID is delegating authority to other actors. And disquiet about DFID's inability to directly evaluate its impact and its inability to plant the flag on this or that bit of UK aid. And this hasn't been an important concern while public support for the aid budget is strong. And our research suggests that over the short to medium term, there is a risk that DFID's discretion may be reduced if the political climate changes. And recent reports about the Conservatives' ideas on vouchers lends force to this conclusion, I think. I'm not in a position to assess, having moved out of ODI and not been part of the buzz, to assess the merits or not of whether vouchers are a good idea or not. But it's a clear move away by the Conservatives from delivering aid through government systems in order to strengthen the government as development actor into another way of doing things, a move, it seems to me, that's away from the Paris Declaration, which suggests that the political debate is moving away from where DFID is now. And even if there isn't this big shift in philosophy, there is a risk that the new Parliament, which is going to be operating in very financially straitened times, will become more risk-averse, less willing to allow taxpayers' money to be pushed through central government channels, which could be subject to corruption and so on, are much keener to demonstrate to their constituents the link between taxpayers' money and results on the ground. This will give DFID much less room to be innovative and restricting its long-term development effectiveness in order to push for quicker, more visible results. So in summary, as Jonathan said, the overall conclusion of the study is that the executive and legislature must forge and sustain a shared sense of objectives for the spending of the aid budget. But consensus isn't an end in itself. It's a continuous process of dialogue requiring political leadership. And I guess my feeling is that there's been a sense of kind of sitting back on the laurels. There is this consensus about aid, and this sense of debate hasn't been forged and maintained. And in the absence of shared objectives and common strategy that come out of that continuous dialogue, this afforded discretion, this managerial flexibility of an agency can be reduced, and its ability to be effective can be compromised in the process. This is what I've been describing while I was at ODI as the flip side of the ownership coin. We talk about ownership of the aid budget or of aid in developing countries, and I think the flip side of that is ownership of the aid budget by taxpayers in donor countries. And unless Parliament and the taxpayer are fully engaged in an ongoing discussion about the way scarce tax revenues are spent on overseas development, ownership of the aid budget won't be built in the donor country, and changing political fortunes and national priorities will lead to DFID changing radically over a relatively short period of time. At least there's a risk that that will happen. And so I think the question that this research leaves hanging is how do you have this conversation, this deep engagement, both inside Parliament, between Parliament and DFID, and between Parliament, DFID and the taxpayer and the public outside. And I believe this is one of the key questions facing those of us who support the Paris Declaration and want its extension. If we ignore accountability in donor countries, we could soon be looking back on the last 12 years as the lost golden age of DFID. Thank you very much.